And now, Legal Perspective with Nick Clekis.
On this week's Legal Perspective, we're taking a deep dive into the United States Constitution and its myriad inner workings. This week we want to welcome Allie Menegakis, attorney at the Clekis Law Firm, to help us understand a term that we've been hearing a lot these days, executive orders. Good to have you with us.
Great to be back. This is a hot topic.
It really is. We hear about executive orders coming out of the White House every single day. So what is an executive order exactly?
An executive order is like it sounds. It's actually not a law, but it's a directive or an order from the President of the United States that addresses the management of operations within the federal agencies. So the President of the United States is part of the executive branch, and under that president has certain powers, and that includes directing federal agencies and what policies to do and how to implement them.
Where does that authority come from?
You know, it's interesting because executive orders aren't actually mentioned in any of the foundational documents themselves, not in the Constitution or any of the amendments.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
It isn't, but it is, inferred from Article 2 of the Constitution. Article 2 talks about what the powers and the duties of the president are. So one of them is that the president has to oversee all federal agencies, and he has to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So essentially, the duty and the power to enforce laws.
Okay, we have a bunch of executive orders out there. I'm just going to pull one out of the hat here. DEI. So there's an executive order prohibiting DEI from getting implemented in government agencies. Mm-hmm. So that's coming straight from the administration. The president put his signature on it. So what does that mean exactly? Where do we go from here?
The President of the United States does have the power to implement certain policies or address certain policies only within its own purview, which would be federal agencies. And an important thing to note is that the President, through an executive order, cannot create a new law. That power rests only with Congress. The President cannot create funding through an executive order. That power still rests with Congress.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So the administration, they get an idea, they want to create an executive order, it goes through the many channels, it gets written up, the president signs it, then it goes into full force and effect. But it's not without its challenges. So you still, as a citizen of this country, can retain the right to challenge an executive order.
There's really three ways that those can be checked. One, obviously, like you said, is anyone that's affected by that order can file a lawsuit. And then the judiciary decides whether that executive order was constitutional or not, or within the purview of the president. The second way is Congress can actually overturn an executive order. They can also stop funding, and that would hamper the implementation of certain orders. And the third way is in change of power with a new president, or that current president could always repeal or amend any previous executive orders.
So what happens if a court does rule that an executive order is unconstitutional?
Well, historically, like anything that's been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court or a court, the other branches of government have to abide by it. One of the biggest examples that a lot of people know of is back in 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled through Brown v. Board of Education that segregation was unconstitutional. Now, that ruling from the court went into effect, but if you remember, the Arkansas governor at that time refused to integrate schools. So what happened then? Well, that's when the executive branch comes into play. And the executive branch enforced that law. So the president at that time, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, issued an executive order ordering military to go to Arkansas and integrate those schools. But the interesting question, I think, would be, what happens if the executive branch does not obey a judicial ruling that an executive order is unconstitutional? That would be essentially a full-blown constitutional crisis, frankly. If the executive branch refuses to abide by a judicial ruling, that would create the very kind of power imbalance that our founding fathers feared. And that is how democracies end up getting, eroded. And when one branch of government dismisses the or doesn't abide by the other powers of the other branches, what does that do? It concentrates power in one branch. In that case would be the executive branch. And that would take us away from a democratic society into an authoritarian rule. And so that's why, acknowledging the rule of law, acknowledging the separation of powers, abiding by judicial rulings is not just some kind of, legal technicality, but it is the foundation of what our democracy stands on. And without it, our democracy would crumble.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Allie.
Pleasure.
Really, really interesting. Well, if you need some advice, you can always go to the Clekis Law Firm and make sure you call them at 843-9000000. Such an interesting discussion with you. And of course, you mentioned the 3 branches of government. We're going to be talking about that next week, so make sure you tune in then. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
This has been Legal Perspective with Nick Clekis.